Hello, everyone. Hi, welcome to this Adobe Fresco Pro Tip series. My name is Fabiola Lara, and I'm an illustrator and podcaster. And today I'm going to show you how to choose the right brushes for your illustration work in Fresco. So a lot of it comes down to personal style preferences, but there's a big technical side to it that I want to be sure you know about so you can really get to know Fresco and use it to all its potential. Okay, so if you didn't know, Adobe Fresco has three different types of brushes. First, here I have my little examples for you. First, we have our raster brushes, which are the first brush option. So like Photoshop, these are pixel-based brushes. So if you've used those brushes, you'll be familiar with these. These are really great because they give you a lot of texture. So here I have also, you have like so many options. I really like this Cezanne brush. I don't know how to say that. I'm not French, but look, check it out. Look at that rich texture. And it adds like other colors in there. If you're seeing it here, this pink has like a little bit of magenta in it. It's really nice. They're perfect for when you want to create illustrations with a ton of depth, texture, and a variety of brushstrokes. Your second option are the Adobe Fresco Live brushes. These are amazing and they're really unique to Adobe Fresco. You can see here we have both watercolor and oil options, and they mimic traditional materials. So here in my second option that I have, my second little example that I have, you can see I have these like watercolor blending, blooming effects happening, and it's all done with this watercolor brush, and you have these flat washes you can add. Let me change the color so it looks a little more exciting. The pressure really applies to it, and you can start dropping like bits of water right on it. So it's really fun, and it mimics traditional materials. So if you like watercolor or oil, you're going to want to use these live brushes. Then lastly, we have our vector brushes. I know this illustration may not look super impressive, but the cool thing is it's infinitely scalable because we're using vector brushes. It's infinitely scalable. And so these brushes are really cool if you want to create really big work like a billboard or like a really large sign. This is the brush you want to use because you're going to be able to scale your illustration work to a huge size. Of course, the downside is these brushes are pretty flat. Like Illustrator, they're flat, and so you have to work with it, so it becomes kind of a style choice. Of course, you can layer different vector brush strokes to create more depth. That's up to you, however you want to use them, but they're really amazing. And the best part is, in Adobe Fresco, you can combine all three together. And I think that's a really unique feature that makes Adobe Fresco insanely powerful. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of today. So we have these three examples I made for you, and then I kind of ruined showing you everything that you can do. The first example I have here, I made these three little flower vases. I really like to draw using like a blocky shape and then adding line work. It's just my preference. So I created these for you, showing you how I would use these brushes depending on my needs. So the first tool we have is the pixel brushes. Like I said, these are the ones that are most commonly used by illustrators because you can get a ton of different effects with it, right? Like we have here basic brushes. These are round, soft round. Then you also have charcoal brushes. We have lettering, marker brushes. You have all sorts of different styles of brushes that you can use. I thought I selected the marker one. Where'd it go? Here we go. Let's make it a little bigger. So here you can see how you can introduce a ton of different textures and mimic what you would use, let's say, in a sketchbook. These are amazing. And the best thing with Adobe Fresco is you can add brushes. You see here I have a ton of brushes. If you open up Adobe Fresco and you've never used it before, you're not going to have all of these brushes loaded in. You'll have a lot of them, but not all of them because there are so many. So if you go here to add brushes, I want to make sure you know you can hit add brushes and then discover new brushes. And you should see all of these new brush packs that Adobe Fresco is constantly updating with the help of Kyle T. Webster. So he has some amazing brushes that are completely free when you use Adobe Fresco. So, if you're like, oh, I really need a gouache brush, you don't really have to go out and buy new brushes, digital brushes. You can search in here and see if maybe Kyle T. Webster has loaded up some brushes that mimic those materials that you are interested in using. So let's see. I have a lot of these added already, but we're going to go ahead and try and add another one so that you can understand how easy it is. So I want these Keith Haring inspired brushes. I haven't seen those before. I'm going to hit add. It says adding in progress. All right, they've been added. I hit done. Let's go over here, scroll all the way down. Here we go. Keith Haring inspired brushes. Let those load up because there's so many of them. Oh my goodness, I'm so excited. And I'm going to recreate this vase so that you can get a sense of how these brushes work. Okay, let's pick the chalk square. All right, let's see what this looks like. I want to use my colors here. All right, let's go for, ooh, I really love that. And so these raster brushes, you can see as you start zooming in, because they're pixel brushes, you're going to start seeing those pixels, right? Not a big deal if you know that you're going to export it at this size. It doesn't matter. But if you know that you're going to blow this up into a billboard, let's say for a client, you might not want to use this brush because it's going to start to look pixely, or you may need to adjust the settings of your canvas to compensate for the fact that it's going to be so big. And there's a lot of math involved there. But if you're going to do something for print, you're going to print at 300 DPI. You can just double check that your settings are like that. So you can see here, I have 300 PPI, so I would be okay. So here are those brushes, and let me go ahead and make it, I want to show you how I would do this. So with this brush, I would go in here, and this, you can see this is a little too big for me, right? It's a little too large. So I'm going to go here, make it smaller. So now you have the option to really tweak it. Here on this third down option, you have the ability to control the flow. So that's how much, it's almost a bit like opacity, but it's how much of that texture you want to shine through, right? So here it's really dense. And then if you lower it, it's less dense, that texture. And then you have smoothing, and this controls how smooth that line is. So if I boost smoothing all the way to 100, it may lag a touch because it's working, but you see how smooth that S is versus if I lower it all the way to the bottom, it gets a little bit jittery. So that's what smoothing's for, in case you haven't ever used it. It's really nice when you need to make a really nice big long curve. That's when you use it. And then you can also open up the brush settings to do even more tweaking. So you can control the spacing, and you'll see it up here. You'll see how it changes. So if you control the spacing, it's like how much of that pattern you want to shine through, not just like the opacity of it. Then you can control the angle. Here, I'm going to make a line so it's a little bit easier to see. So the spacing there is not great. You want it a little bit more tighter, so you can lower it. But if you wanted it to be like that, you could do that if you needed a print like that. And then, let me go into the brush settings. There we go. I'm going to lower it so it's a line again, change the angle if you wanted to. And here we get into even more detail with these brushes. So the size jitter is how big you want the jittering of this brush to be. So if you want it really high, you can boost it up. And the best thing is that Adobe Fresco will remember this for that brush. So if you get your brush perfect, you're like, oh my gosh, I've just customized this brush and it is now my favorite brush ever, it'll remember, so you don't have to worry about it. And then you can control so many things here. Oh my gosh, there's so many options. And you just have to play with it and see which ones are the ones that you need to customize to get the perfect brush. So that's scattering. So that controls the axis of that pattern for that brush. And transfer, I haven't played with transfer yet, but let's see what it does. Opacity jitter. Okay. There's a lot of options here. I usually just use the main ones plus a little bit of the ones for shape dynamics to control how much of that I want to come through. All right, so to show you how I would create this with this brush, now that I've got it down perfect, I would just start drawing, and you can see that it has that perfect little bit of texture that I wanted. And I don't know if you noticed, but if you start drawing a line, that's not very perfect, right? I have smoothing to 0. I could boost smoothing so that my line is a lot smoother, or I could say I always want to use it with zero smoothing. And then to create a line, I would just hold it at the bottom of that line and it snaps to a perfect line that you can then move around. And then the curve. See, if I wanted to make that curve a little bit more perfect, I'd turn smoothing up and go a little faster. There we go. Look how nice that curve looks now. And then I'm going to color it in with that texture because I want that texture to be all across that shape. There you go. And on top of that, you can add, oops, I missed a little spot. You can add other brushes, of course, other layers with other brushes. So I'm going to try and use one of my favorite brushes here that I have, this rough pencil in brown. And, oops, I left a little drop. Now I can start drawing. I'm using a clipping mask by hitting this little button on here on the side. And that has a little arrow pointing down in case you can't see it. And I can start drawing. And again, I can hold and it snaps to a perfect line. So that's the benefits of using the brush. The Raster brushes, they give you a lot of chunky texture. Now, I want to move on and tell you more about the live brushes because these are extremely, extremely valuable. Oh, one more thing about the Raster brushes. Let's say you bought a brush for Photoshop and you're like, I love this Photoshop brush, but I wish I had it on my iPad. No problem. You can simply airdrop the file of that Photoshop brush and open it up in Fresco. I've done this a million times. If you just airdrop it, Fresco will show up and say, do you want to import this brush? And you hit yes. So whenever you are shopping for brushes, if for some reason you need to expand your collection beyond what's available in Adobe Fresco, any Photoshop brush that you airdrop to your iPad or email to your iPad, however you want to get it over, will open up directly in Fresco. So all your favorite brushes that you have that maybe you haven't installed on your iPad, go ahead and take a day to do that and they'll just be in here for you. You can see I have some brushes that I made myself right in there. So if you want to learn how to make custom brushes, be sure to tune in on Thursday for that one. But now let's move on to the live brushes. I'm going to unhide this one. Boom. So that was the raster brush example here. Lots of texture. We have texture coming through with this brush. Now, the watercolor brushes are also pixel-based brushes, and they add texture, but they just work and operate completely different. So if you really love watercolor and oils, these are the brushes that you're going to want to start exploring with because they just have so much richness. Okay, so I'm going to hide this just to give you a live little demo here. So I'm going to go back to my pink. So these live brushes, the minute that you click that button, you're going to get the option for watercolor or oil. So watercolor will look like this. Oops. Okay, here we go. I'm going to make the brush really big so you can see it really well. I'm going to zoom in. So you see that, and you see how it it really reacts like oil in the sense that it fills in the water. So these brushes are really nice if you want to get a watercolor effect. And let me quickly show you the oil ones just for comparison. The oil ones have like the paper or like a canvas that would shine through. So you can see the difference here. You can see here we have this texture of like canvas underneath with oil paint on top, and all the different oil options kind of react differently with that canvas. So just so you know what you're working with here, those are your two options. Now I'm going to work back with the watercolor one and just show you how these ones, I'm going to just make one big circle. And then you can hit the little circle in Adobe Fresco that you can hold down and just start adding pure water. You see that pure water button that I get? And that kind of adds water so that the watercolor paint can flow down. So that's something that's not available in the raster brushes. These are only available in the live brushes. I'm going to zoom in so you can see the difference. So here's me painting. And if I hold down the extra button in Adobe Fresco, you can see how I just added water and kind of I'm just flicking my hand to get the water to flow onto that paint. And another thing you can do is layer different colors like you would in watercoloring, and these are going to react with that bottom layer. So you see how I'm dropping that pink? Let me see if I do a color that's a little bit more high contrast. Let's pick this green just to give you the example. So here, this is all watercolor that's wet. So if I drop a little bit of green, I'm adjusting the pressure that I'm putting down. It'll start flowing. And then if I hold down the pure water button, now I can blend it out even further. So this is a really, really cool way to get those natural looking traditional watercolor effects that you really can't find in other programs, and is very unique to Adobe Fresco. You get that awesome bloom. And then another option is this watercolor spatter. So if you want to add spatter, you can, and I'm going to make it really big so you can see the difference here while we're playing. You see those drops? They kind of just spatter all over. Now, another thing that you can do, this is all wet, right? So it's all wet watercolor. You can dry it. So if you hit these 3 little dots on the right-hand panel, kind of towards the bottom of Adobe Fresco, you'll pull up this layer and you can scroll down and hit dry layer. So if you dry it, now this is dry. So now if you want to paint with more watercolors, it's not going to affect this layer. So if I add, oops, let me change my brush back to let's say the wash. Now that wash isn't going to blend so much with the bottom layer because it's dry. So it blooms a little as traditional watercolor would react, but it's not fully blending like this. So these are kind of the pros of using the live brushes, is that you can really customize and get those effects that look just like watercolor. I'm going to keep playing here. And you can really start layering without affecting the bottom layer too much, but it still looks realistic. And I think, now I'm pressing it really hard to purposely blend it, but that's kind of the perk of using these brushes, is that you can make something look like it's watercolor without, having to make a mess. And of course, because we're working in Adobe Fresco, if I turn off the background layer, now this is transparent. So say you want to have like this organic watercolor blob on your website, you could export this PNG, put it there, and it would look legit. So this is one of the reasons I really, really love Adobe Fresco live brushes. Now, let me show you. I'm gonna hide this layer and pull back up. Okay, so here you can see I did that exact technique using the Adobe live brushes, the Fresco live brushes, to kind of create these flowers. And, similar to the raster brushes that we just went through, you have the settings here. So I just want to review these settings. First, you have the size setting, which is, exactly what it means. It's the size of the brush that you're using. Then you have the flow. So this is how much flow, basically a little bit like the opacity, how much flow you want to come out as you press. There you go. And then you also have water. So I have water set to 100. So it's very liquidy. Now, if you were to lower that, it's going to run a lot less. And you won't get that flow of water at the end like I was showing you. So let me turn that the flow all the way up. You see how it blooms a little bit towards the end like that? If I were to turn the water all the way down, that wouldn't happen. It's just flat. You don't get that like watercolor, the liquid effects don't come through. So that's, how you know what you can control. And lastly, you also have a ton of brush settings. So if you want to change the angle of your brush, the spacing of the watercolor, the scatter along the edges, you can do that. And, you have the velocity dynamics, which control a lot of that flow as well. So you can really, really fine tune this brush as you need. Then lastly, we have the vector brushes. And these, you don't have a million options, but you have exactly what you need. Let me show you. I'm going to go back out here. and show you here with another layer. Okay. So here you have basic brushes, which are going to give you kind of cover every single different shape. The one I use most often is the round brush, but if you were doing any sort of lettering, I could see it being really beneficial to use these other brushes that have different angles, right? So I could write a beautiful like happy birthday here without having to do all that much work, because I could also increase the smoothing to make it even smoother. There's a bit of a lag when you increase the smoothing a lot. So you have to keep that in mind, but that's because it's trying to smooth every single point as you're working it. So, you have to be mindful of that. And then these are the basic brushes, which I used to make these bigger shapes. Let me show you. So I can just quickly, the benefit of using a vector brush is that while you're coloring, you can just kind of make the shape and then use the paint bucket tool to fill it in, and it's going to look great. So I do that a lot when I'm using vector brushes. And then the vector brushes that I really love that Adobe Fresco has, that not a lot of people realize are in here, are the jitter brushes. Because if you like texture like the pixel brushes, but you need to work with vector brushes in order to create scalable work. Let's say it's for a really big billboard or a really big piece of paper or poster or something. These are really good. And the jitter brushes have they kind of mimic a little bit of what would happen if you were to use like a pixel brush. They have a jitter. They're not perfect. They're not like a perfectly even stroke. And I think that creates like a more natural drawing style, like almost more handmade. And then you can also choose heavy jitter. So I'm just drawing a straight line, but this line has like a lot of jitter, which I think is super interesting when you're trying to make something that doesn't look so clean and polished, but is really clean and polished. So that's the benefits of the vector brushes. And of course, as you zoom in, it's clear, super crispy. Here, I made this one just using those brushes. And the best thing too is you can work, let's say at this size, and then hit the export, publish and export. And you can export it as, you can export directly for Illustrator right in here. Where is it? Here we go. Open a copy, Illustrator for iPad or desktop. If you hit this, you can choose if you want to open in Illustrator for iPad or Illustrator for desktop. So you can expand it, you can add even more and take it further. So this is really great when you're trying to illustrate something that's vector, but you don't want to use those clean shapes that sometimes can feel a bit confining when you're using Illustrator. Here you can create some really natural shapes, which I think really help make your vector work not look so vectory when you don't want it to be. And lastly, something I want to be sure that we get to is how cool it is that in Adobe Fresco, you can mix vector and raster. Now, of course, the raster is going to limit the scalability of it, but when you want to create something that looks just as sharp and clean, but still add a little bit of that juiciness that pixel brushes give you, this is amazing. Okay, let me show you here with this example that I have. This is a vector flower vase, right? Now, let's say I'm like, oh, I love this, but I wish I had a little bit of texture. I can take those live brushes, the live watercolor brushes, add a masking layer, and just start adding, let's say, for the sake of being able to see it clearly, I'm going to use green. I want to add a little bit of green watercolor to that, but I want it to have more water flow. So I can, oh, that's too little. Let's see, let's boost this up. There we go. So I can add some of that watercolor and then I can blend it. I want more water in there. So I can just start blending it. So this is the cool thing is now you're mixing these things in a way that you wouldn't be able to in Illustrator, and you're doing it all in one app. So there you go. You can see how I'm adding those blooms to kind of give it a different effect and just playing with it. And so now you have a very sharp and clean Illustrator object that also has a bit of raster. Again, if you were to blow this up, the texture is going to get a bit pixelated, but it might be totally okay depending on your use case. So I love to do this and just really experiment with all the different things I can do in Adobe Fresco, mixing all these different kinds of brushes together. Now let's see. Here's another one, and I could just add a little bit with a clipping mask, add some watercolor to it, and just start playing with it. It's beautiful. Oh, where'd it go? Oh, I'm using the eraser brush, that's why. Now here we go. All right, so this is exactly what I'm saying about being able to mix everything. Here you can see all the different brushes that I used, and I hope now you know which brushes to select for your projects. All right, guys, I'll see you again soon. Bye.